I'm telling you, Tom, some of this stuff, I just sit back and I am truly flabbergasted. Some of them make money by traditional means, and some of them make money by untraditional means. The ones that do it with untraditional means are so amazingly powerful. That's always going to be there. And you know what? They busted them, and you see the show still went on. I roughly tell them, look, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to go hard for 2 or 3 minutes, maybe a minute, and then when I go down to whatever, come in there and stop it. $40,000, sometimes twice and 3 times a week, flying everywhere, first class accommodations for over 10 years. Yes, I fucking took it.
In a set of exclusive phone calls and voice notes over the last several months, today we bring you the incredible story of one of Japan's most prolific combat athletes. With virtually no fighting experience, how exactly did Bob Sapp, an NFL reject, set MMA records that will likely never be broken? This is the rise and fall of a Japanese icon, the Bob Sapp story. Colorado Springs, 1983. A million miles away from Japan, a young 10-year-old Robert Sapp Jr. arrives home to his father, bloodied and beaten. 130 pounds large, he's a target for older kids, and it's clear that Bob's life wasn't going to be easy from the outset.
My dad was a former Vietnam vet, and he made Colorado Springs highest sergeant, first black sergeant in the history.
In the 70s, it was tough. Bottom line is, I was a black officer in a uniform doing a job in Colorado Springs. And that's what should have happened, but didn't.
I was like 10 years old. I got beat up by a 6th grader. And my dad would put me in every sport. And guess what? I sucked. You know what I mean? I had no idea. I was scared, because the guys are older and all of that stuff. But they just kept me in there.
To combat the street fighting, Bob's father, Robert, put him into sports, joining most of the programs at Mitchell High School, a place that he'd rather not be.
Well, dude, I think back then every kid wants to do something else. You know what I mean? I wanted to play video games and to go after school and to play to spin the bottle with the girls and all that kind of stuff, you know what I mean? And my parents was no having that. You're gonna do this sports over here, you're gonna do this and that's it, and you can read at the library, and other than that, that's all you're gonna go through and do.
Nevertheless, Bob's success in sports, and especially football, set him on a path. His uncle, Jeff Sapp, had already had tremendous success in the naval football team, achieving All-American honors, the Silver Helmet Award, and even played in the 1976 Japan Bowl. But to follow in the footsteps of his uncle, to play football in college, he would have to dedicate himself to achieving the grades.
They knew that I would have some hard time with the SAT and ACT. So I would study my ACT and SAT from 8th grade. And I failed it a lot of times. Okay, if you ask me how many times I failed that fucking SAT and ACT, and they took records of it. And by the time I was a senior and I would get ready and sign with the University of Washington, I had to take the ACT or the SAT one last time. I believe it was the ACT. And I took it and I passed that fucker with such fucking flying colors. It was no even funny, you know what I mean? And my counselor come over, he said, Bob, I have never seen anyone with such perseverance. Look at this, you gotta stack these tests and you never gave up and you earned your scholarship.
And his hard work scored him a place at Washington University in 1994. And Sapp cut his teeth as an offensive lineman as a sophomore. It was here that the famous whammy in Miami occurred.
Heward toward Fumble in the end zone, recovered by Washington. The Huskies celebrate in the end zone where Sapp recovered it.
There it goes. Sapp picks it up.
Miami hadn't lost at home in 9 years, and the Huskies were a 2-touchdown underdog against a dynasty. Miami was headed for its 8th season of 10-plus victories in a 9-year stretch, and Bob played his part by recovering a fumble in the end zone for a touchdown. He finished off his Washington University football career as captain of the team, which led him to the 1997 NFL Draft.
Madison Square Garden, New York City, where Selection Day is seen a flurry of trades at the top of the order. Orlando Pace is the player everyone covets in an NFL draft filled with incredible stars.
Picked at number 69 in the third round, Bob was sent to Chicago, but his NFL career was not what he probably would have dreamed as a kid. He wasn't able to make the cut and he didn't make the roster at the Bears, and his time there would only last one season. He was subsequently signed by the Minnesota Vikings in 1998, but ran into a few problems when he and a few teammates were suspended after a violation of substance policies.
You know, it was a lot of things that went on in the NFL, and it's very simple. Back then, me amongst like all the other players, there was a substance known as androstenedione in GNC. I took that with NGNC, and me and amongst other players got in trouble for it, and that was all that was. There was nothing that was huge. There was no big mystery. Nobody was behind, gyms and tradings and doing things like that. Yeah. That's not what it was.
According to Bob, he had taken a supplement purchased at GNC that was contaminated with androstenedione, a weak androgen steroid hormone made famous by MLB St. Louis Cardinals first baseman Mark McGwire.
First and third, 2 out. Into the field! Number 70! How much more can you give us, Big Mac? Number 70!
After he set a then record 70 home runs in his 1998 season, the Associated Press's Steve Weinstein broke a story referencing a bottle of androstenedione in his locker room. It was the story that blew the lid off the steroid era in sports and in turn shed light on Victor Conte, a nutritionist who distributed hard-to-detect anabolic steroids to athletes with the help of chemist Patrick Arnold.
Dozens of the biggest names in sports will be taking time off from competition to tell a grand jury what they know about the maker of a so-called designer steroid.
Over its years of research, androstenedione, though still banned, shows no real evidence of being able to improve performance. It has been speculated, however, that the drug was used as a cover for other substances, when McGwire ultimately admitted to using other substances that year too.
Yeah, I was using steroids thinking it was going to help me.
Nevertheless, Arnold's manufactured steroids were all over the scene in the late 90s. Erythropoietin, or EPO, tetrahydrogesterone, or THG, and human growth hormone, or HGH, amongst others. And in an interview with Joe Rogan, Conte actually made direct reference to Bob discussing his football years.
Patrick made like a gallon of this stuff. We only needed a couple drops. He sold a whole bunch of this stuff, like a gallon, to Bob Sapp. My understanding is this stuff was all over the NFL. It was, I guess, during this time he was out of the NFL, and I think there was a period of time when he played in the Canadian League before he went to Japan to do the K1 fighting. But the point is, this stuff was very widely distributed, is my understanding.
Quite simply, he's mistaken. One, I never was in Canadian Football League, so I have no idea exactly why he even says that stuff. I don't even know who that guy is to whatever, but I know of him, but I've never met him or anything, so. I did get called in there to the FBI to find out what all athletes are taking to whatever, but they called every athlete that was famous to do that stuff. And, it kind of, the buck ends with me because I'm overseas. We don't do anything. Who cares?
After another year of inactivity on the field, Bob was yet again cut and moved on to the Baltimore Raiders in 1999. It was at this time that an Achilles injury began to plague his movement.
Severe, massively severe Achilles tendonitis. I could not even walk. When these Raiders had me put through this, this really hardcore drill of this twisting and turning, it really messed my ankles up really bad. It was so bad.
And following a third and final move to the Oakland Raiders, Bob's career in football was coming to a close after not finding a spot in the NFL Europe League with the Barcelona Dragons. On his return to the US, on the advice of a former teammate and the advocation of famous pro wrestler Jesse Ventura, Bob made his way into professional wrestling, developing his skills in the National Wrestling Championship. That, however, was when his life took a turn for the worst. The FBI had informed him that his entire life savings were gone. A financial advisor he saved money with had stolen everything.
I got a call from the FBI to let me know that all my life savings and everything was gone. So I was in a big time loophole. I was depressed. I was out. I was in bad place, brother. Woo! There was some horrible times then, Jack.
What happened is I did save my money. However, I saved it with a terrible financial advisor. So he just took my money and ran off with it. So I did have to go to work. Any job, any odd job, any job, that was what I wanted. That's what I had to do. So whether it was delivering dead bodies from the hospital to the morgue or learning some life insurance, I was doing so, including bouncing at nightclubs. I was doing anything and everything just to work, just to get by.
So all of a sudden, Bob had a lot riding on a professional wrestling career, and thankfully, WCW called, inviting him to a trial.
I was homeless and went to the WCW, where they taught me how to do the pro wrestling and taught me all this great. It was awesome. Kevin Nash, Lex Luger, Bill Goldberg, all of those guys really coached me through, saw me through. I mean, Kevin Nash, he sent me and gave me all of his clothes because at that time I really needed some additional clothing, okay? So he gave me all his t-shirts and all of these things from his sponsors.
It was here that he met Sam Greco, former K1 fighter and coach of notable UFC fighter Jimmy Crute.
I had a good friend of mine who was living in the States at the time with WCW, and he said to me, would you like to trial in the WCW? I went to the trials and there was 72 wrestlers at this trial. And I met this big guy over there, Bob Sapp. Bob sort of took a liking to me. We went through the trials, sure enough, and we were both selected. We got contracts with WCW. It was during that time that WCW got bought out, went bust. Got bought out by WWF at the time. And Bob rang me up and he says, you wouldn't fucking believe it. He goes, I'm out of a job.
You see, it was just a matter of time before I, Vince McMahon, bought my competition.
Do I remember him? Yes. Did we have a couple conversations? Yes. Did I see big upside there? I truly did not. When he walked into a room or when I had a conversation with him, I wasn't overly impressed with his natural, authentic charisma.
With WCW going bust and Eric Bischoff years later admitting he wasn't impressed with him, Sapp was lucky enough to catch the attention of the cable network FX, which was looking for someone to take on former Chicago Bear William the Refrigerator Perry in a celebrity amateur boxing match called the Tough Man competition. So with not much else on his plate, Sapp agreed.
When WCW went bankrupt, I had one more other fight to do, and that was against William the Refrigerator Perry, a former football great, my idol.
And it was during that time that we were in the States. I got him ready for a boxing fight against Perry the Refrigerator.
Sam Greco trained me. I fought him, and, you know, I beat him up.
Following his celebrity boxing match with Perry and WCW closing its doors, Sapp was at a standstill. His budding wrestling career was cut short when his contract wasn't brought over to the WWF, and panic started to set in.
And Bob says, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going back to K1. That wouldn't be a problem. He goes, well, what the fuck am I going to do? I said, why don't you come across? He goes, no, I'm shit scared. He goes, I don't want to. Literally, he goes, I don't want any trouble, Sam. He goes, I'm shit scared of fighting. He goes, I don't want this. I want to do this because I'm an entertainer. They were having K1 in Vegas.
Yep.
I said, let me introduce you to Kazuyoshi Ishii and a few of the others, and we'll take it from there. I said, but do me a favor, do not fucking sign anything.
As it turned out, K1, the Japanese kickboxing promotion, was in town, and giving his friend a helping hand, Greco brought Sapp to the K1 World Grand Prix 2001 in Las Vegas after showing his boxing match to Kazuyoshi Ishii, chairman of the promotion. During this time, the Japanese fight scene was just on top of the world. Relationships between K1, Pride and Antonio Inoki's team were great, and putting on shows in the US gave them the opportunity to scout for new talent. And with fights like Frank Shamrock versus Shannon Rich that night in Las Vegas, it was clear that the talent didn't really need an extensive fighting background. Entertainment was the key word.
When I did that show, they said, hey, listen, you're a star. You just have no idea who or why or what you're doing. We have all your statistics on you. And we will see you tomorrow in Las Vegas. A limousine will pick you up. Next day, I look out, go, oh my gosh, the limousine. I got dressed, I went down there, and they happened to be K1. They were from Japan.
They see Bob Sapp and their eyes light up.
And I went and ate in the Bellagio Hotel. They pull out a folder and they're like, yep. And these Americans got no idea how strong he is. Okay, so we'd like you to come to Japan and see if you enjoy it. They never told me I was going to be doing fighting, by the way. This is more like pro wrestling, you know, just a little harder. At the end, they gave me like $5,000 cash. Now, who goes eats at a big restaurant in a limousine and all of a sudden gets $5,000 cash with a bunch of strangers, you know? And I ended up taking the cash, obviously.
In 2 days, they signed him up for 5 years. What they realised with Bob, we'll teach him how to fight, but this fucking guy can entertain. He's just got this gift that he can entertain at a drop of a hat, and the Japanese took a liking to that because it wasn't all about the brute strength anymore. It wasn't about the technical side. It was about, wow, this guy's an entertainer. He's 180 kilo and he's 6'4".
And within a matter of days, Bob Sapp was on a one-way flight to Japan. Not entirely sure what to expect, how he'd be used. One thing was for sure though, that was that he had signed a 20-fight, 5-year contract. And with no initial interest from pro wrestling, Bob was sent to Josh Barnett and Maurice Smith for martial arts training.
I went out and I was in the middle of doing this training, and Maurice Smith and Josh Barnett said, show up and train. Did I have time to train? No. You just get in there, get it done. And sometimes I win, sometimes I lose. And, it's okay. They don't mind. Ishii used to laugh and say, Bob's so special. He has no need to train. And I was just like, all right, And honestly, I'm fine with that.
As a K1 representative, Bob was sent to Pride Fighting Championships against former professional wrestler and longtime Fighting Network Rings competitor Yoshihisa Yamamoto. And however wild and amateurish the bout was, Japan loved it, with 10 million viewers drawn to his aggressive size and charisma. And K1 and Ishii were right, he was a star. And before you knew it, a month later, he was back in the ring for K1, raining down illegal strikes on Tsuyoshi Nakasako, and igniting a brawl to the cheers of the Japanese crowd. He was disqualified that night and subsequently lost his kickboxing debut, but it didn't matter. Win or loss, the people loved him. He made his television debut shortly after, appearing on numerous television shows and advertisements, all the while competing in record time. That's right, 22 days later, Sapp was back in the Pride ring, this time against a formidable opponent, the last challenger for the Pride middleweight title, Kiyoshi Tamura. But the sheer size mismatch proved too much for the middleweight that held wins over Renzo Gracie, first UFC middleweight champion Dave Menne, and first UFC welterweight champion Pat Miletich, and the fight was over in mere seconds. The Domination cemented Bob as the biggest thing going in Japan, and that meant one thing for him: a fight with Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Pride heavyweight champion.
You have to go back to the days of when I fought Nogueira. And you can see in the ring, when I hurt him really bad, you can see over there and I say, listen, are you okay? Are you going to be okay? You can see that in the ring. When I asked him, I was punching him and I stopped. And I said, hey, are you all right, man? Because I was seriously concerned. I knew he was hurt. And so I was like, man, I was like, Bob, just calm down a little bit because, you're going to hurt somebody really badly in here. And you want to know something? My athleticism saved him. The fact that I jumped, like, in an arc, that saved him. You understand, if I would have went straight up and straight down, it would have killed him on the spot. And Nogueira knows that, okay? And his neck knows that. He's got a fused neck to whatever.
The question is, did Bob really hold back? Was the competition of Pride just that? Held back? The truth is, the loss of the fight had virtually no effect on Bob's superstardom. In fact, he was more famous than ever. He had put the pound-for-pound heavyweight champion through fire and back, and not a month later he was back in the ring with a win over Cyril Albidi, delivering 2 big hammer fists to the back of the head. 5 fights in 5 months, and K1 had absolutely no intention of slowing down. In fact, one of the greatest kickboxers of all time is next for Bob, Ernesto Hoost. In his 3rd professional kickboxing fight, Bob, who had seemingly never thrown a kick in his entire life, was fighting an 85-win, 16-loss veteran in the opening round of the K1 Grand Prix. This was technique and experience against nothing more than explosive strength and dynamic power. And Sapp and Hoost put on an absolutely epic fight that saw somehow Sapp prevail after a doctor stoppage due to a cut. Whether he won this fight by design or sheer grit, This was a defining performance for him. He had obtained true fighting spirit from his peers and the Japanese crowd, and in turn secured the support of none other than Antonio Inoki. New Japan Pro Wrestling had come knocking at K1's door, and Bob was immediately inducted into Inoki's inner circle. An injury from the Hoos fight gave Sapp the opportunity to explore his pro wrestling chops, and he made his debut against Manabu Nakanishi in front of 50,000 fans in the Tokyo Dome.
I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I loved Japan. Antonio Inoki took me out. He said, "Hey, can you do the splits?" I broke down. Boom, I did the splits for him real quick. I said, "All right, what you think?" He said, "Yeah, you got to come over here and do pro wrestling." So I was like, "Okay, I'm going to do pro wrestling now. I know how to do that from WCW." So I was happy. And, I was able to make some additional revenue. Okay, I think I was making at that time $400,000 signing bonus for the year.
And the success of his debut saw Sapp pitted up with one of the greatest Japanese wrestlers of all time, the Great Muta, in the main event of All Japan Wrestle 1. A match he won with a flying headbutt from the top rope. For Sapp to come into the Japanese pro wrestling scene and be put over in such a dominating way was just unheard of for a newcomer, and it was clear that Sapp had a bright future in wrestling ahead of him. For now though, Sapp was set to take on Semi Schultz in the quarterfinal of the K1 Grand Prix, but after an injury forced Semi out, K1 wasted no time setting up a rematch against Hoost in December, which hosted 74,000 fans back in the Tokyo Dome. The build of the big rematch resembled something straight out of a pro wrestling promo, and while the feud seemed heated, behind the scenes, other shenanigans were playing out in untelevised recorded fights.
What Ray Steeple and I, we started laughing because we were fighting every week. We started coming up with throwing the towel, and then they would throw the towel in, and K1 said, "Listen, you guys start throwing that fucking towel in, and we're gonna throw it back." So there ain't no throwing in the towel rule anymore, guys. You guys gonna have to fight. And we're like, "Dude, man, how come we're fighting every week?" And we're just laughing. I was like, "Dude, going to war, this is soldiers, guy." We're just totally cracking up. Okay, so then what we do is we would just we just go the distance and we just make it. So then they were like, "Okay, you guys, stop fucking running around and going the distance, okay? Because we know what you guys are doing." And they would laugh. It was tongue in cheek, and we'd be laughing. So we did know that we had a very, very hard schedule. And even back then, they were doing tournament fighting and had to do regular fights on top of all that stuff.
Regardless of the weekly companionship amongst the fighters, surviving the blistering and calculated attacks from Hoost yet again, Sapp scored another titanic win. In the space of 8 months, with 7 fights under his belt, Bob finished out an incredible 2002 main eventing Inoki Bumbaye 2002 against professional wrestler Yoshihiro Takayama. Sapp utilised his athleticism, securing a round 1 armbar for the finish, and with a trophy in hand and Antonio Inoki on his side and Japan winning him on, it seemed like anything was possible for him. The success of Combat during 2002 in Japan was at an all-time high, and whilst K1 tried to kick 2003 off just as fierce, their second Wrestle 1 event with All Japan Pro Wrestling was the start of a truly troubling year. Having back-to-back blockbuster bouts, K1 decided to kick Bob's year off back in pro wrestling by developing a match against his K1 rival Ernesto Hoost. In a main event that headlined over Bill Goldberg and the Great Muta, Hoost and Sapp, 2 novices, wrestled for 5 minutes. After a bizarre set of entrances that failed to engage the crowd even in the slightest. This was a huge misstep, and the event signified that K1 had steered dramatically in the wrong direction. And from the highest of highs came the lowest of lows when Kazuyoshi Ishii and several other K1 executives were arrested on tax evasion and embezzlement charges. It had turned out K1's high-profile arena-filled events were nothing more than a room of smoke and mirrors. Kazuyoshi Ishii was supposedly paying out a lot of money to foreign fighters and had also desperately wanted to sign Mike Tyson, and allegations had surfaced that a contract for Mike Tyson was forged in order to divert money, and that fighters were being paid under the table and the evidence of such acts were intentionally destroyed. In the meantime, Bob was returned to the combat ring, set to face another gargantuan obstacle in Mirko Cro Cop in March of 2003. Since the failure of Wrestle 1's second event, Bob had been kept pretty busy in the media with a bizarre appearance in his very own musical debut that even came accompanied with a full behind-the-scenes movie. And with little time to train, Bob walked into the ring with a prime Cro Cop.
I did suffer an orbital blowout. Cro Cop did break my orbital. That type of injury is seen when someone does like it's called cementing the gloves, and they have cotton and then they put water in there and they make those gloves very, very hard. So it makes it very hard and heavy. So when you get punched, his cornerman was very famous for doing that throughout K1, and that's why they started checking the gloves and stuff. After that inspection of that injury, that fight, you would never see a Cro Cop fight in K1 again, and he actually went to Pride permanently. He no longer was with K1.
The orbital break forced Bob out of any competition, and K1's golden goose was on the shelf. Cro Cop indeed didn't fight for K1 again that decade, and he and his manager Ken Imai, who had previously been very involved with K1, moved permanently to Pride. Despite the trouble in which Ishii had gotten himself into with a supposedly fake Tyson contract, K1 had no intention of slowing down. If they were to secure a genuine Tyson contract and generate enough cash to navigate the choppy financial waters they found themselves in, they needed to go big. They needed to return to Las Vegas with the man that intended to fight Tyson, Bob Sapp. And following the visceral loss to Cro Cop, Bob needed a defiant return to re-establish himself as the fearsome competitor that emerged on the scene only a year before, but he also needed a notable win against an opponent that could legitimately sell a potential matchup with the most feared boxer in the sport's history. That role was given to none other than notorious UFC competitor Kimo Leopoldo, a man of equal size and stature to Sapp, who was widely known in the American combat world. So come August 15th at the Bellagio Hotel, the very place K1 signed Bob, in front of a small crowd and Tyson himself, Bob inched his way past Leopoldo in a massively controversial bout. Tyson at the time was going through a very public bankruptcy proceeding. It was reported that he had $23 million in debt, and a farcical bout with Sapp in whatever manner K1 intended to have the two compete in would have been a much needed income stream for him. However, the planned bout never materialized as Tyson was unable to obtain a Japanese visa. Kazuyoshi Ishii ended up going to jail along with a mysterious Bangladeshi man who was arrested in another country and was sentenced for making phony contracts for Ishii. So Sadaharu Tanakawa, a former pro wrestling and MMA writer, took over. He created the Fighting and Entertainment Group as his umbrella group to run operations.
Well, there's no problem. If you had a gun, shoot him in the head.
Needless to say, 2003 was a tumultuous year for K1, and the alliances once forged amongst the different combat promotions severed in turn. With K1 in decline, Pride Fighting Championships made a bid to seize control of the market. It was alleged that DSE, a parent company of Pride, were also facing financial problems with the suspicious passing of Naoto Morishita. One of the Pride bosses at the start of the year, Nobuyuki Sakakibara, began plans to put their very own New Year's Eve show without K1 or Inoki into action. He partnered with Fuji TV for Pride FC Shockwave 2003 at the Saitama Super Arena, whereas K1 went with Tokyo Broadcasting System at the Osaka Dome.
Okay, so now we're getting into kind of like the American definition of what's a crime and what's not a crime and all this kind of stuff where it gets all mixed up. Some of them make money by traditional means and some of them make money by untraditional means. The ones that do it with untraditional means are so amazingly powerful to whatever means. The ones that do it untraditional means, you're going to talk about ones that are kind of involved in the fight game per se, okay? What I can tell you is that they are far from being in jail and they have no criminal record, so they are far from being a criminal. Is it the same kind of rambunctious crowd to whatever, a motley crew to whatever that used to be in the 20s when I was in my 20s running around? No. I do understand that you're like, okay, Bob, whatever, Ryzen just got busted for some more Yakuza stuff, you know what I mean? So that's always going to be there. And you know what, and they busted them, and you see the show still went on, Ryzen's still around, you know what I mean? And besides my sponsor wanting to throw flowers at Mayweather or going to go stock him in Dubai, you know, I have no idea what Taka's doing. But besides that, you know, I mean, everything's going fantastically well, you know what I mean?
And while Pride encountered problems with Inoki's crew and battled for the contracts of Fedor and Krokop for the end of the year, K1 quietly trotted on throughout the year and set to culminate at their New Year's Eve show with the signing of a popular sumo wrestler, Aki Bono. He was, of course, set to face Sapp. Since his encounter with Tyson in August, he had 2 more fights in September and October, but most notably returned to New Japan Pro Wrestling in the main event at Ultimate Crush 2, wrestling alongside Inoki's army, Takayama, Fujita, Shinsuke Nakamura and Minoru Suzuki. The significance of this return was monumental, so much so that he main evented over Hulk Hogan that night. Whatever failure Sapp started the year off with in wrestling had diminished tenfold as he was revealed as the last entrant to the star-studded event in front of 50,000 strong at the Tokyo Dome. So when New Year's 2003 rolled in, K1 without Pride or Inoki for the first time, Sapp vs Akibono gathered a 43% viewership. That's roughly 54 million of the 127 million people in Japan at the time. The success of the 2 larger-than-life men ushered in a new era for K1, the era of the super heavyweight, and in his honor, the division and events were named Beast.
So they started bringing Chohonman over. What it did, it took the essence out of fucking K1.
Bob's success as a larger-than-life fighter ushered in the freak show era. Gone were the days of selling out arenas in Japan with high-level competitors, and in its place were the comedy skits. Over the next year, Bob competed in 5 more fights, playing his part in the new trend for K1, but it was clear that the 53 million viewers at the end of 2003 was going to be his definitive showing. But regardless, his popularity continued to strive, becoming the first and to date only African-American IWGP heavyweight champion in New Japan Pro Wrestling, and even hit the cover of Time magazine. So where do you go from here? That's right, Hollywood. With appearances in Japanese film and television over the past couple of years, Sapp's notoriety garnered him a shot in the US with spin-off action film Elektra.
I give credit to Kevin Feige on that one because he had sent us Time Magazine Asia and Bob was on the cover. And we were looking for some big guy to play this part and it was just, no-brainer. He's a gentle giant, but a giant.
Despite the critical and commercial failure of the film, his charisma on set was contagious, and he went on to score a big role in the Adam Sandler-led comedy, The Longest Yard.
Just so you know, we're putting together a football team. Love you to join.
Will you teach me to football?
Sure, we'll teach you to football, won't we, caretaker?
Yeah, I'll teach you anything. Just don't eat me.
With a starring role in the biggest movie of the year, it seemed like Bob was on top of the world. And with his 20-fight and originally 5-year contract coming to a close following the successful one-night Grand Prix win in 2005, Bob was absolutely in the driving seat for renegotiations. But unbeknownst to him, it was clear that a major shift in the Japanese fight scene was on the horizon.
welcome UFC representative Dana White.
Today is a great day for me. I'm very excited today.
– 2007. With K1 nowhere near the spectacle of what it used to be and Pride losing its TV contract with Fuji TV after allegations of Yakuza involvement, the once glamorous country for fighting foreigners to thrive in is in dire decline. With most talent moving on from the scene, many fighters were left struggling to secure contracts that could pay them anywhere close to the rates of the early 2000s. Bob's 20 minutes of fame in Hollywood were now long gone, and unsure of what direction to take, Bob was introduced to Steve Rusick, then manager of Gary Goodrich, and he suggested there might be a better route for Bob.
So what happened is I was in Poland, I believe, and my manager at that time was Steve Rusick, and he managed a lot of people. He owns a car dealership in California. And Steve said, Bob, Gary's over here slurring on himself. He can barely walk. The other guy in here just had a stroke, okay? And they're still fighting over here. Now, you have to have an understanding that when you fight overseas, it makes absolutely zero sense to go over to a third or fourth world country, give it all you got, possibly get hurt. I mean, you better speak the language in the hospital, because if no, they could be taking your arm off. Then they're giving you a tremendous amount of medications. If you have no background in medication, or if you have no idea what you're taking, you can just get yourself really messed up. So when Steve said that, he said, man, let me tell you something, Bob. You can go through and fight really hard, and you're going to get a bunch of injuries, and then you can get ready for the next one, or you can just lose them, go back through, lose them, get paid, set up your retirement, and be done with it, period. He said, what do you think you're going to do? I said, shit, I'm no fucking stupid. There's no way I'm stupid. That's right. So I went over there, and yes, I did lose. And yes, the promoters, and now because it's old enough now we can talk about some of these things because the gag order is off, okay? So yes, and I was also a producer on the show, okay, a promoter on the show, so I'd get a little extra money for bringing in the things because I was too busy working the show. I had no time to train, nor would I train anyway. And if you want to say how it would be just like this. I would say, okay, if I need to train, it's the typical over $100,000. If I don't need to train, just come in there. Hey, it's 40 grand. What do you guys want to do? And I give that, and everybody and they'd say, you ain't training. Just come over here and let's sell the tickets and let's go. Cool. Yes, get it, because you got to look at that amount of cash. That is $40,000, sometimes twice and 3 times a week, flying everywhere, first class accommodations for over 10 years. Yes, I fucking took it. I roughly tell them, look, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to go hard for 2 or 3 minutes, maybe a minute. And then, when I go down to whatever, come in there and stop it. And you can see one of the fights in Poland I had against the guy, he was a young guy. He's like 135 pounds or something, 70 kilos or something. And he comes out and goes against me. At that time, I was 170, 180 kilos. I would have broke this guy in half. And there's just no way I'm going to do that.
Over the course of the next 10 years, Bob made this his mantra. Since his introduction into combat, winning and losing had never been significant for him. He was praised in a win or a loss, and he was paid the same for a win and a loss. But long gone were the glory days of the Brotherhood of K1, where fights weren't televised, allowing fighters to just coast, and the rise of the internet made it impossible for no one to notice.
Bob, how are you?
Bob, how are you? All right, I'm pretty good now. Now, you got to get it right, Errol. It's Bob the Beast.
Do you remember the point where you had this sort of epiphany where you didn't have to actually, go in there and compete? You could just collect these paychecks and collect the L's on your record as well.
Okay.
Give me an honest answer now. Give me an honest.
Are you
insane, Bob? Bob, you've lost your mind.
Goodness,
listen, you've been in some great moments in the sport. Your moments over the last few years have not been one of them. I appreciate you coming on, but you're giving me too much of a headache with this laugh.
But the truth is, Bob Sapp was never a martial artist. He was never a fighter. He was a down-and-out, larger-than-life character that had been swept into a rotating mill of Japanese entertainment, and for a short time, spectacularly rose to the challenge, defying everything anyone could have ever expected from him. And while Bob still chases that big payday, whether it's a fight with Mike Tyson that will never materialize, or circus act appearances tied to Rampage Jackson, there's one thing I know for sure. Over the months that he's let me into his life, listened to his stories, is that Bob Sapp is a kind person. A kind person that got used by an industry that never really cared about him.
Remember, I've made over $1 billion in Japan, so we were really good friends, and and yes, they did take advantage of me on some aspects or whatever. But you know what? It's okay. I look back on it and smile and laugh and enjoy it. It's one of the best highlights of my entire life.